Runner beans are a fairly good crop to grow outside in the temperate climate that we have here in Ireland, and they seem to be able to handle the higher winds and the cooler conditions better than the climbing or French beans that I typically grow in the polytunnels. Runner beans can produce a huge crop over a fairly long part of the growing season if we can get them growing well early enough in the spring. I tend to just let these vigorous plants grow up whatever support I'm using without any additional care, letting the leaders loop over the top and allowing the plants to bulk out with lots of side shoots. Some people will prune back the main leader when it reaches the top of the support in order to encourage the development of these side shoots. And I was wondering if pruning them even more will change the way that they grow and impact the pattern of harvests. So this past year I grew runner beans in one of my polytunnels in 3 different ways, including a set of plants that were heavily pruned. And it was really interesting to see how this affected the growth of the plants and the harvests. When growing runner beans, I've never been really sure how close to space the plants or what density of plants was best, as I think it really depends on how long the plants will be able to grow. When the plants are sown or transplanted farther apart, the initial harvests will be smaller, but as the season progresses, more of the side shoots will develop to fill the space and continue to produce more pods for harvesting. And the longer they grow, the bigger the plants get and the more crowded they seem to become. Though in the Irish climate, the cooler conditions that we usually get in late summer and early autumn and the occasional early frost tend to prevent them from getting too big. I have also found that the pods later in the season tend to not be as good a quality, but this is partially because I usually get tired of the frequent harvest, especially when the pods become harder to find as the plants get more crowded. Unlike most other beans, the runner bean plants are perennial, even though we usually grow them as an annual crop, sowing fresh seeds every season. They tend to develop a big root system that can store a lot of energy for growing faster the following year, and this is something that we can take advantage of. A few years ago, I transplanted the roots from some of these plants into one of the polytunnels so that they could overwinter and grow for a second season. These plants produce many vines early in the spring and also produce pods much earlier than the plants grown from seed, but they also became really big with many vines and side shoots. This made it more difficult to find all of the beans for harvesting and took up a lot of space in the polytunnel. I've also noticed that the long trusses tend to only produce a smaller number of pods compared to the much larger number of flowers that blossomed. I have heard different ideas about why this happens, including stress for the plants and pollination issues. I explored this issue with the overwintering plants in the polytunnel last year, where there was a lot of bumblebees pollinating the flowers, and I also triggered a lot of the flowers by hand in order to effectively rule out pollination issues as the factor. I figured it was either some kind of deficiency or stress with the plants, or that runner bean plants in general can only support so many pods and will abort the surplus when necessary. I made a video about this, and another grower and YouTuber made a video response in which he talked about pruning off all of the side shoots that developed on the main stems of the runner bean plants that he was growing outside. He thought that this might lighten the load for the plants and encourage them to concentrate on developing more pods, rather than growing and developing more side shoots and additional flowers. I thought that this was really interesting, especially as I've been doing this type of heavy pruning with closely spaced tomatoes, cucumbers, and other vining plants. This is a very common method of regularly pinching off the side shoots in order to control the growth of the plant and encouraging the plant to focus on the fruit. I wanted to see what a similar method of pruning runner beans would do to the quality and duration of the harvests, and to see if more of the flowers would develop into pods. So I set up a trial this past year in one of the polytunnels. I left one of the overwintering plants to grow for a third season, added another twine to support several plants that were sown from seed that I would let to grow without any pruning, and I grew 2 rows of closely spaced plants that I grew from seed that I intended to heavily prune. The overwintering plants sprouted a lot of vines at the beginning of the season and produced the first pods for harvesting by the end of June. With all of the main vines and side shoots climbing up the one piece of twine, this plant got really big and filled out the space, overshadowing other crops, and the pods became more difficult to harvest as the season went. This 3-year-old plant produced fairly consistently for over 10 weeks, but was knocked back later in the season by spider mite. And to be honest, I got fairly tired of all the harvesting, searching for new pods among all the foliage. I was able to harvest almost 12 kilograms of pods from this one runner bean plant that had been given a fair amount of space, though not all of the pods were great quality. It's hard to determine the yield for this, as it's hard to measure the amount of space that this plant actually took up, especially as it was growing at the end of the bed, but it was getting close to 20 kilograms per square meter, which is a huge yield. I direct sowed the standard annual plants beside this overwintering plant on the 21st of May, thinned to 3 plants to climb up 1 piece of twine, and just let them grow and didn't do any additional pruning. These plants produced the first few pods about 9 weeks after sowing, but there wasn't a good harvest until August, about 5 or 6 weeks after the overwintering plants had been producing well. Overall, the harvest from these 3 plants was substantially less than from the one overwintering plant, and they also tended to trail off later in the season, I think mainly because of competition from the more established neighbor and the spider mite infestation. With the plants that I was going to heavily prune, I sowed 2 rows of seeds, with several seeds at each station spaced 25 centimeters apart in the row. One row I thinned to 1 plant per station, and in the second row I left 2 plants to grow up the 1 piece of twine. In hindsight, I should have had just 1 row down the middle of the bed, as I underestimated how far the flower trusses would grow out horizontally. And these plants became quite crowded, with 24 plants in the 2-meter section of bed. As the plants grew, I regularly removed the immature side shoots that developed at each leaf node along the main stem, leaving the immature flower trusses. And I continued to check to remove any additional flower trusses and side shoots that developed later. I initially pruned off the growing tip of the main stem once 2 or 3 leaf nodes had developed above the support wire at the top of the polytunnel, thinking that this would help support the plant. A few weeks later, I realized the plants were quite congested at the top of the polytunnel, so I removed a fair amount of this growth and used a clip to support the top of the plant. I also pruned the leaves and the flower trusses at the bottom of the plants so that the developing pods were not hanging on the soil or out into the paths. It would have been better to do this type of pruning earlier so that the plants didn't put in the resources into this extra growth at the top or bottom of the plant that was eventually removed. It was strange to see the plants like this, with fully developed leaves and long trusses developing pods, without all the extra new growth and new flowers developing. These pruned plants started to produce the first pods only a few days before the standard plants that were sown at the same time about 9 weeks earlier. But they produced many more pods faster, with all of the pods developing to the usual harvestable size within about 2 weeks. They produced a smaller overall yield of about 6 kilograms per square meter, but this is still a reasonably good yield considering it was only 11 weeks since they were direct sown in the polytunnel. And it was a faster and bigger harvest over those few weeks, rather than a slower harvest over a longer part of the growing season. Interestingly, the row with twice as many plants did not produce twice the yield, so the density of the plants is still an important factor in determining how much each individual plant will produce. But with this type of strategy, it isn't about producing the most per plant, but having a larger yield from a higher number of plants in a given area in a shorter period of time. These heavily pruned plants still did not develop all of the flowers into pods. Quite a few flowers simply dropped off, and some immature pods seemed to have been aborted. But I didn't look closely enough to see if there was a difference between the pruned and the unpruned plants. I still don't know what is causing this, or if it's something that's always going to happen with runner beans to a certain extent. I think there are situations where it's useful to have longer growing plants that are unpruned and take up more space and produce a steady yield for longer, where we treat them as a crop that grows for the full growing season and we don't remove them until it's generally too late to plant most other crops. But I often get frustrated with harvesting later in the season and often leave the pods to get too big and tough, but also don't want to remove the plants as it seems a waste. So I think there's also benefits in a strategy of growing more plants closer together that are heavily pruned. We can get an earlier and faster crop and then remove the runner bean plants and get another crop into the ground while there's still some heat left in the summer. This method can also be used for growing runner beans later in the season or in climates where there is a very short growing season, to force the plants to focus on a limited number of pods rather than diverting those resources and energy into growth that doesn't have a chance of developing into a harvestable crop. These heavily pruned plants do take more time and care for the regular pruning, but they also take less time for harvesting. But I'm not sure if there would be much difference in the amount of time spent on the pruned or unpruned plants compared to the amount that they produce. I also think that there can be real benefits in heavily pruning the plants that are used for producing dried seed, and I've only realized recently that runner beans can produce a really useful crop of tasty dried beans for eating. In our damp and cool climate, it can be hard to get seeds to develop and dry, especially if they're overshadowed by excess growth. But if I can encourage the plants to focus on a more limited number of pods and get them to develop faster, then dried beans becomes a more viable crop, especially in the outside gardens. And with all the side shoots removed, the beans will be exposed to more sun and air movement, which will help them to dry faster and reduce the risk of mildews and molds. This is something that I want to explore next year, both outside and in the polytunnel, with runner beans and some varieties of climbing French beans that are more generally grown for producing dried seed and can also produce a lot of side shoots. Because growing dried beans and pulses in this climate can be difficult, and I think heavily pruning the plants may be a useful way of getting a decent crop, or at least it's something that would be interesting to explore. One of the really cool things about this Red Gardens project and this YouTube channel is a lot of the things that I end up trying or experimenting with lead to other things to explore, and this could be based off of my own observations or other people's comments, and it's interesting in this case that it came from a response video. So I want to thank Gary for that, and I would encourage people to check out his YouTube channel at Baltic Homesteaders. This is all part of a process of learning and sharing with a broader community that is a core part of this Red Gardens project. If you like videos like this and want to support my work so that I can produce more of them and have the resources to spare, please check out the links to my Patreon and PayPal account in the video description. I want to thank everyone who has supported this project in the past, as without this support, I would not have been able to do these explorations or to make this video. And I also want to add that liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing really helps the channel, which also helps the project. But more importantly, thank you for watching.